There is a specific Tuesday in your memory that you keep returning to, not because anything dramatic happened, but because of how ordinary it was, and how much that ordinariness turned out to mean. You were standing in a grocery store checkout line. Slightly tired, slightly distracted, the kind of low-grade background noise that describes most of your Tuesday afternoons. The person ahead of you was buying maybe 15 items. Cereal, a carton of eggs, some kind of pasta, a few other things. When the total came up, she paused. Just for a second, barely visible, the way people do when a number arrives and the mental arithmetic begins and the answer is slightly uncomfortable. She put the pasta back. The cashier voided it without expression. The line moved on. You watched that and felt something you didn't immediately have a name for. Not pity. Something quieter than that. A recognition, maybe. Because you remember what that pause feels like from the inside. The calculation running underneath a normal face. The decision made in real time about what you actually need versus what you thought you needed 30 seconds ago. You paid for your items without looking at the total. Not because you're careless. Because at some point, without a ceremony or an announcement, the calculation stopped being necessary. And you didn't notice when it stopped. That's the thing nobody tells you. Wealth doesn't arrive with a signal flare. It accumulates like sediment, layer by layer, until one day you realize the ground beneath you is several feet higher than it used to be, and you have no memory of it rising. This is not a story about becoming rich in the way the phrase gets used online, the overnight kind, the dramatic kind, the kind with a before and after photo and a caption about mindset. This is about the other kind. The slow kind. The kind you almost missed entirely because it looked so much like your regular life. Here are 7 signs you became wealthy without noticing. Not the flashy indicators, not the obvious ones. The subtle ones. The ones that are easy to overlook precisely because they don't feel like anything at all. The first sign is that your relationship with small numbers has completely changed, and you didn't register the shift while it was happening. There was a version of you that knew exactly what was in your checking account at any given moment. Not approximately. Exactly. Because the difference between $340 and $290 was a real difference, the kind that affected decisions. Whether you got the car washed this week. Whether you ordered delivery or made something at home. Whether you split the cost of a shared expense or absorbed it yourself without mentioning it. Then, somewhere, the precision dissolved. Not through carelessness, but through irrelevance. The $50 question stopped being a $50 question. It became a decision so small it didn't require decision-making at all, just action, and then moving on. You started buying the better version of things not because you were being extravagant, but because the cost difference between the adequate version and the better version had simply stopped registering as a variable worth weighing. That sounds like a small shift. It isn't. When your brain stops running automatic arithmetic on routine purchases, it's because the baseline has moved. The floor is higher. What once required calculation no longer clears the threshold for conscious attention. That is not a personality change. That is a structural change. The architecture of your daily life has shifted, and the math your mind used to perform automatically is now unnecessary overhead that your decision-making process simply dropped. Most people who experience this assume it means they're being irresponsible. They think the anxiety is supposed to stay, that the vigilance is the responsible thing, and its absence must mean something is wrong. It doesn't mean something is wrong. It means something changed. The absence of low-grade financial anxiety isn't a warning. It's what it looks like when the thing producing the anxiety has been resolved. The second sign is that you started choosing time over money without noticing you were making a trade. There's a moment that comes quietly, usually during something mundane. A home repair you could figure out yourself. A drive you could make but would cost you 4 hours round trip. A process you could handle manually but would take an entire afternoon. And instead of calculating the cost of outsourcing it, you find yourself just arranging for someone else to handle it, without internal debate, without the slight guilt that used to accompany that kind of decision. Paying for convenience used to feel like a luxury. Something slightly excessive, slightly indulgent, the kind of thing you justified to yourself or didn't mention to other people. Now it's just logistics. You need the thing done. Someone else can do it. You arrange that and move on. This is the second sign, and not because spending money casually is the goal. The calculation has fundamentally inverted. You used to convert money into hours, wondering if the cost was worth the time you'd save. At some point the calculation flipped direction entirely, and you started converting hours into money, understanding intuitively that your time produces more value per unit than whatever you'd be saving by doing the thing yourself. When that inversion happens quietly, without announcement, something has changed in how your financial reality is structured. You now have more control over the trade between time and money than you once did, and the default setting of that trade has moved accordingly. The third sign is the way other people's financial conversations now land differently, and you find yourself listening more carefully while saying less. You are sitting at a table with people you've known for years. Someone is talking about a renovation, the cost, the contractor bids, the decision about whether to go with a cheaper quote or pay more for the one who came recommended. The numbers in the conversation are real stakes for the people having it. You can hear that. And you listen genuinely, but from a distance you can't fully explain. The conversation is happening on a register that no longer maps directly onto your own decisions. You don't say this. You know better than to say this. You ask questions, you offer what's useful, you're present in the conversation in every way except one. The visceral shared weight of the numbers is not landing in you the same way it's landing in them. You notice that. You notice the gap. Not detachment, not indifference, nothing so clean as that. Just a growing asymmetry between how financial conversations feel to the people around you and how they feel to you. The same numbers. Different gravity. The temptation at this point is to minimize your own position, to speak with a calculated imprecision that keeps you feeling like you're still operating in the same territory as everyone else. And maybe you do. Maybe you've been doing it for so long it's become reflexive. But underneath the social navigation, you know the gap is there, and it has been quietly widening for longer than you acknowledged. The fourth sign is that you started thinking about money in terms of systems and time horizons that most people around you simply don't use, and somewhere along the way you assumed everyone thought this way. This one is harder to notice because it happens inside your own head, in the way you frame problems to yourself, and most of the time you have no point of comparison. You hear about a business opportunity, and your instinct isn't to calculate the profit. It's to ask what the underlying structure is. Whether the revenue is tied to your active presence or whether it runs independent of you. Whether the cash flow is predictable or whether it depends on constant new input. Whether the asset appreciates quietly over time or decays the moment you stop feeding it attention. You ask these questions before you ask how much it makes. You ask them automatically. Or you hear that someone is making impressive money at a demanding, prestigious job, and your first thought isn't envy or admiration. It's a quiet observation about the architecture. What happens to that income if they stop? What is the half-life of their earnings if their circumstances change? You don't say any of this out loud because you understand it would read as either dismissive or strange. But the question runs automatically, the same way a carpenter's eye automatically notices whether a corner is square when most people just see a wall. The analytical frame shifted, and you applied it so consistently for so long that you stopped realizing not everyone uses it. You started assuming the way you evaluate a financial situation was simply the way financial situations get evaluated. It is not. It's a perspective built over time through deliberate practice and repeated exposure, and it marks a real change in how your thinking operates. The fifth sign is that you've stopped performing financial stress, and you didn't notice when the performance ended. There is a social grammar around money that most people follow without ever consciously choosing to. The small complaints about prices. The expressions of mild hardship around large expenses, a car repair, a medical bill, a home maintenance surprise. The solidarity language around shared financial pressure. These are social signals as much as they are factual reports, and most people deploy them automatically to stay connected with the people around them. At some point, you notice the phrases leaving your mouth and feeling slightly inaccurate. Not entirely untrue, but not quite matching your internal experience. The car repair that was genuinely disruptive a few years ago. The price increase that actually changed your behavior before that. The language around financial stress was still in your vocabulary, still socially available, but it had started to separate from the actual experience. You kept using it for a while, probably longer than you realized, because stopping would require an explanation you weren't prepared to give, and because the language itself is social adhesive, a way of being in the same territory as the people you care about. The fifth sign is not that you started speaking with blunt precision about your financial position. Most people who arrive here never do that. It's the slight interior lag, the half-second pause where the phrase and the feeling used to arrive together and now they arrive separately. The words are right there. The weight behind them is gone. You notice the gap and close it with tone. But underneath the performance, you know the material is no longer current. The sixth sign is that your definition of risk has quietly changed. There was a period in your life when risk felt like exposure. The downside of a bad decision had real consequences, visible, life-affecting, difficult to recover from. A failed venture meant a genuine setback. A wrong call meant a real step backward. Risk was not abstract. It had texture. It had consequence that you would feel in your actual daily life if it materialized. At some point, the texture of risk changed. Not because you became reckless. Because the consequences of a failed decision, while still real, stopped threatening the floor. The floor had become solid enough that most risks played out well above it. A bad investment didn't threaten your stability. A failed experiment cost time and capital, but not your baseline. The downside scenarios changed shape, still uncomfortable, still worth avoiding, but no longer existential. When the floor becomes permanent, when the worst realistic outcome of most decisions stops threatening the fundamentals of how your life is structured, risk changes its character. It becomes more like maneuvering within a stable system than walking a line above something you couldn't survive falling into. Most people who arrive here still carry the old orientation toward risk for years, sometimes permanently. The body remembers the feeling of the narrow ledge even after the ledge has widened considerably. You catch yourself being more cautious than necessary about things that genuinely can't threaten you, not from wisdom, but from a reflex calibrated to a version of your circumstances that no longer exists. That residual caution, slightly out of proportion to the actual stakes, is itself the sixth sign. The calibration hasn't caught up with the structure. The seventh sign is the quietest one, and the most uncomfortable to sit with. You started to understand things about the people you care about that they don't know about themselves. Specifically about money. About the structures underneath their situations. About where the constraints are really coming from, and what would actually change things, and what would not. You can see it in a conversation, in a plan someone shares with you, in the optimism around an approach that has a specific and predictable failure mode they haven't identified yet. You don't see this because you're smarter than them. You see it because you've walked through the specific rooms they're standing outside of. You've made the mistakes that rhyme with the mistakes they're about to make. You've watched what capital does when it arrives in a structure that isn't ready for it. You've learned, at some cost, the difference between the thing that looks like the solution and the thing that actually functions as one. And you have to decide, every single time, what to do with what you can see. Sometimes you speak. Carefully, indirectly, asking questions rather than delivering answers, offering "have you thought about" rather than "here is what you should do." You try to make the knowledge useful without making the person feel diagnosed, which turns out to be a harder skill than most of what you've actually learned about money. Sometimes you don't speak because the timing is wrong, or because they're not asking, or because the thing they need to learn can only be learned by going through it, and your visibility into the outcome doesn't change what they need to experience to get there. You sit with that. The specific weight of knowing more than someone you care about and doing the harder work of deciding whether the knowing is yours to share, and how and when. The seventh sign is not that you have resources. It's that you carry a particular kind of quiet. The quiet of someone who has mapped enough of this territory to understand what they're looking at, and who knows the map is only useful to someone who is ready to read it. Here is what none of these signs feel like from the inside: triumph. Not one of them. Not the absence of small number anxiety, not the time versus money inversion, not the shifted risk calibration. None of it arrives with the sensation that the movies and the posts and the ambient cultural narrative about wealth say it should. There is no scene between before and after. No physical shift in the air around you. What there is, and this is the part that catches most people off guard, is continuity. Your Tuesday looks almost exactly like the Tuesday before. The errands are real errands. The coffee tastes the same. The commute, if you still have one, uses the same roads. The people who matter to you are the same people, still navigating the same joys and pressures and uncertainties that belong to being human in a specific place at a specific time. The number in the account is different. The structure underneath your life is different. But the life itself, from the outside, from most angles, looks like a continuation of the life you were already living. Which means this: if you are waiting to feel rich, you may have already crossed the line you were watching for. The signal won't be obvious. It will be a Tuesday in a checkout line where you notice you didn't look at the total. It will be a conversation where the numbers land differently in you than in the people around you. It will be a quiet moment in a hardware store or a kitchen table or a parking lot where the thing you expected to feel like arrival just feels like a regular morning continuing. The architecture was never going to announce itself. That's the point of architecture. You drive home the same way you came. Same road. Same car. Nothing about the outside of your life has announced anything. But the foundation is there. And you built it.